Hello, and welcome to our workshop. This workshop was previously delivered by SMU's Academic Learning Services Writing Center. As a result, you may hear references to other workshops, be prompted to take part in group activities, or hear references to the active chat from the original delivery of this session. As you follow along, feel free to pause the video and participate in exercises and activities as best you can. We hope you enjoy the workshop.
So we're going to talk about communicating across cultures and do a couple of activities where we sort of look at those cultural things that we may take for granted as being like normal, right? When you start to interact with people from other cultures and in other new situations, maybe start to recognize like that your normal may not be another person's normal, right? And that's it. So I work internationally and I've had to learn a lot about other cultures in order to be successful doing that. Of course, my approach is slightly different because I'm in a teaching position, and it really is part of like the duty that I have as a teacher of English, I think, to understand the cultural background of my students. It makes for better communication, it makes for better interaction, and it makes for better outcomes and results for my learners. But really, your motivation for successful cross-cultural communication is the same as mine, in that it's building relationships and it's maintaining relationships. It's avoiding trouble spots or seeing where a trouble spot has popped up. These are called in communicating across languages, this is called a critical incident, and it's a real thing. Like when cultures kind of collide and it creates some kind of situation that needs to be managed, like an issue. This type of study, this area really started to develop a lot out of business, right? So people wanting to work abroad and wanting to have multinational corporations and expand their operations had to learn about the cultures in which they wanted to operate. And, that started, with globalization. And of course, we know that that is a one-way road and we're only becoming more globalized. And even with COVID, even more globalized, I feel. So 4 parts to our presentation today. Characteristics of culture. So despite what culture you're from, there are some standard characteristics that we can sort of make large categories, and helps us to define and to better understand the actual dimensions of culture. So when people say, how do you define culture? What is that? And people say, I want to learn about your culture. What is it that they're talking about culture? So we're going to talk specifically about some vocabulary that you can use that shows more competency or more sensitivity and understanding about how to talk about culture. Really important in a community like St. Mary's, which is very multicultural. You will, maybe you're starting to see that now, which is really our strength. Part 3, a couple of models of culture. So I did not create these. These are standard, well accepted, commonly presented models, and have a quick look at those and see some different ways that you can start to think about culture and your own and others. You'll see there's an iceberg here on my slide. The Iceberg model of culture is probably the most well-developed and the most famous. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Just as you're looking at the iceberg, I'd like you to sort of look at those features and what is it that is striking? What stands out to you about this berg of ice? Part 4, applying cultural awareness. So again, some practical tips, some linguistic tips about how you can show and exemplify your sensitivity and your knowledge in your communications. The 5 characteristics of culture. Very quick overview. Culture is acquired, it is shared, it is unconscious, It is dynamic, and it's a thing you do. It's an action. We're thinking of culture here as a verb, right? Rather than a noun or a thing. So acquired, a good example of this would be language. We are not born knowing language. We are not born knowing our greater culture. We acquire it through our family, through our teachers, the institutions that we are involved in, the media. We learn culture as we grow, although we don't learn it consciously, right? Just as language, I'm sure you don't remember learning your mother tongue as a young child. That's acquisition, right? Now you may be learning a language, but when we're young and we do it subconsciously, that's an acquisition of language. Culture is shared. So culture can really not exist in one person. There are some rare examples where, for example, you may have a final member of an Amazonian tribe, or you have the last person who speaks Cornish in Wales in the UK, and maybe they passed away in the mid-1900s. That might have been the last person who represented an aspect of that culture. But culture must be shared, and it is shared typically amongst people who are also from that culture. It can be defined by language, ethnicity, nationality, religion. Then, of course, there are subcultures that we share with people. If you're very involved in an activity, if you're also a classical musician, there may be a subculture there. Or if you're very involved in sport, there may be a subculture there if you are very serious about swimming or football, for example. So we're all part, and it's possible to be part of multiple cultures, a broader culture, and then smaller cultures that we take part in. Culture is unconscious. We are not explicit about our culture, which is a great thing, but also means that we can take some things for granted, meaning something that may seem, I said earlier, normal to me, may seem very strange to another. And that's because we are often not explicit about our culture. And that can be different according to different countries as well. Some countries and cultures, for example, multicultural countries like Canada, tend to have more conversations about what makes a culture what it is, because we are so confronted, and I say that in a positive way, but we're so intertwined with others and other cultures and other religions and languages in Canada that, you know, maybe it's slightly less conscious depending on where you are. If you come from a country that has a long traditional culture, maybe an Asian country, a Middle Eastern country, maybe, you know, everyone eats at this time, people do this activity on this day, or festival day, we eat this on this day, we don't eat this on this day. But again, mostly unconscious, right? We've acquired that, we share it, and we don't talk about it, we just do it. Culture is dynamic. Anything that lives changes. Any living organism, from a flower to a language, and language is a living thing. Maybe not in the conventional sense, but in that it changes. It is ever changing, it must adapt, and our culture must change and adapt too. For example, you know, attitudes toward women in work have changed a lot in my culture in the last 50 to 100 years. What about you? Is your culture, what about the role of parents, or the role of a man versus a woman in a family? Is that the same as it's always been, or has that changed? Attitudes toward time change, attitudes toward our society, globalization, money, it's changes. And if it doesn't change, then I'm not sure what happens. Culture is an action. It is something that we do. We can choose to take part in a culture, and the most obvious way to do this would be to learn a language, right? A lot of people see language as that sort of first main um, opening or entrance into a culture, but there are many different ways to take part and engage in a culture, right? Something you do, what you eat, how you think, your social activities, how you pray or worship, if that's a part of your life. So culture is a very active thing, and I love that we can kind of choose. And in some ways, I think you can pick and choose. But there, you may have heard the term cultural appropriation. And, this is a dynamic concept about, stealing and not attributing to cultures that are non-dominant. And this is a really interesting conversation that's happening now at universities. And I'm sure you're going to encounter this. And if you want to talk about it, you know where to find me. So we're going to talk about cultural competence. Competence is a knowledge and a skill that you have in a field, in an area. So of course, we're talking today about our competence in communication and in connecting with people who may be from a different background than us. There you see on your screen some lexis or vocabulary related to cultural competence, how to talk about it, how to frame it, cultural awareness, the context, a critical incident, diversity, cultural identity, stereotype, and competence. So I'm going to put you into some small groups. And in your groups, I'm going to ask you to match the left and the right column. So we have a list of vocabulary and a list of its definitions, and I'd like you to just match them. I am going to go back to our PPT, and I'm going to show you the answers. Here they are. You can see lots of little lines connecting things. Oopsie. I'm not going to spend too much time here. We only have a few minutes left. Now we've sort of met a few people, have some of the vocabulary. Let's talk about those models of culture. Okay, so what do you know about an iceberg? What are like the features of an iceberg? What do you see when you look at the iceberg from a distance? What you see is a small sort of mountain of ice floating in the water. It's beautiful. They're really beautiful. They're sort of blue and crystal and white and really magical. But as someone from the North Atlantic, I know that the iceberg is actually a dangerous thing. And it's dangerous because all of the ice is actually under the water, right? So the iceberg model acts as a model for culture because from afar, we can see something obvious. We see the surface culture. We see what people wear. We see how they wear their hair. We see jewelry. We see the kinds of ways that people want to present themselves. Do people cover their hair? Do people expose it? Do people cover their skin? Or do people in this culture show more skin? So we have these very obvious visual indications. Then as we get closer to the iceberg, which means the culture, so for example, if you spend some time in the culture, or if you get a friend who's from a different culture, we start to notice differences, but we need to observe closer to see these. We start to see how people in the culture maybe interact, how they touch each other. Do they kiss on the cheek when they meet? Once, twice, 3 times? Do men only hug and kiss when they meet? Or do women only hug and kiss women when they meet? Do people show that they're very happy or that they're very sad in public? How much emotion are people willing to show at all is very cultural. How we use our body. Do people use their hands, use big gestures? Are they very animated? Or are people more reserved and quiet? And what does that say about their culture? So I cannot go through all of the points here, just want to put them up for you. Now, as we move deeper into the culture, now this requires more than proximity. That means more than being close, more than observation. This requires a deeper understanding, usually through some kind of inquiry, like asking questions, reading about a culture, asking questions of institutions, learning about schools, learning about their religion, learning about how people work together, how they relate to each other within a family. It's easy for me to say, oh yes, in this culture, marriage is important. But, you know, I could easily say that from afar without knowing exactly what the roles of different partners are within a relationship, or their attitudes toward children and raising children. That's not something that I can really gather just by observing or being close to. That requires a deeper inquiry, deeper asking questions and curiosity, and satisfying that through relationships and literature. The next model is the onion model. Well, what do we know about an onion? It makes you cry. It's delicious. But also it has these rings, right? And the thing with the onion model is that I like is that there's no center point, right? We just keep going, and there's more onion. It keeps going. And the onion model is meant to show that all of these layers, although some may be closer to the surface than others, each of these layers does represent cultural dimensions. Okay, so how someone dresses and presents themselves, how someone is named. Maybe names are very important in your culture. Maybe your name includes names of ancestors, or maybe you're named because you're, one of your parents had a favorite movie star or rock star. So a name can indicate what we put importance on in our culture. As we go in, we get smaller, our preferences. So things you have to maybe observe more closely and start to experience yourself. We get further in, and we get things like religious beliefs, personal, private understanding of self and others. Who I am as a daughter to my parents versus a partner to my husband. Like that is a very sort of internal level, and sometimes we don't even acknowledge those things to ourselves. So how could we explain to another, like, what is a sister like in your culture? Like, whoa, I've never really thought of it, even though I've been a sister in my culture my whole life, right? Now, the final model is the coconut and the peach. So what are the features of a coconut? What are the features of a peach? How are they similar? How are they different? So the coconut is sweet and juicy and soft on the outside, and then that pit is very, very hard, like a rock in the middle. And then the coconut is the opposite, right? Have you ever tried to open a coconut? I don't recommend it. It's very hard on the outside, but then once you get in there, that beautiful soft coconut milk and the flesh of the coconut, sweet and delicious. And the coconut and the peach model are really meant to show you, like, some people, some cultures like to present a very outgoing, kind of sweet, smiling demeanor. That is considered culturally appropriate. And in other cultures, it's culturally appropriate for you to be more austere or serious on the outside, but that doesn't mean that there isn't warmth and sweetness, right, in both. It just means that, or that there isn't resilience, or there aren't hard-held, strongly held beliefs. It's just, where are they in context of the individual person and the culture? So, like, what are you? Are you a coconut or are you a peach? And personally, I think I'm kind of a peach, but sometimes I have to be a coconut, because I find that working with students from different cultures, they don't always respond to my peachiness. Some of my learners prefer a harder shell, a more serious approach, and I can do both. And it might be something that you could consider, that not everyone will react the same way to your either your outgoing sweetness and friendliness, or your maybe cooler, more collected exterior, right? That's quite cultural. So is your culture a coconut or a peach? Are you a coconut or a peach? What do you think? Exercise 2, models of culture. I'm going to put you quickly into a group. We don't have a lot of time left. I just want you to decide if you are a coconut or a peach, or if your culture is a coconut or a peach, and why.